November 23, 1944, Camp Clarinda, Iowa. The snow had begun to fall just after dawn, light flakes that drifted down through the bare branches of oak trees and settled on the roofs of the wooden barracks. Inside Compound B, Unteroffizier Klaus Hartmann pressed his face close to the wire mesh window, watching the white landscape emerge from the gray morning light. The cold seeped through the walls, but it was nothing compared to the cold he had known in Russia, nothing like the bone-deep freeze that had gripped him during the winter of 1942 when his unit had been caught in the Rzhev salient. Here, in this prison camp in the American heartland, there were stoves that burned coal, blankets that were clean and thick, and meals that arrived with mechanical regularity. He had been a prisoner for 7 months, captured in France after the breakout from Normandy, and in those 7 months he had learned that captivity in America bore no resemblance to the stories he had been told. That morning, as the snow continued to fall and the prisoners assembled for roll call in the compound yard, the guards announced something that Hartmann did not immediately understand. Tomorrow would be Thanksgiving, the American guard said in halting German, and there would be a special meal. Turkey, he said. The word hung in the cold air, strange and foreign. Truth on. The men around Hartmann exchanged glances, uncertain whether this was some kind of joke or test. They had been promised things before, small comforts that sometimes materialized and sometimes did not. But turkey. The idea seemed absurd, almost offensive in its generosity. They were prisoners of war, enemies of the state that held them. Why would their captors feed them turkey? Hartmann returned to his bunk and lay down, staring at the wooden planks above him. He thought of the Thanksgiving he did not understand, of the abundance implied by the promise of such a meal, and of the slow, creeping realization that had been growing in him since the day of his capture. The world he had been fighting for, the ideology he had embraced, had been built on a foundation of lies. And here, in this camp in Iowa, surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, he was beginning to see the truth. To understand the shock that German prisoners of war experienced when they received Thanksgiving turkey in American prison camps, one must first understand what they had been told to expect. The Nazi propaganda machine had spent years constructing an image of the United States as a nation in terminal decline, a mongrel society weakened by democracy, corrupted by capitalism, and incapable of sustaining a modern war effort. German soldiers were taught that Americans were soft, undisciplined, and divided, that their armies were commanded by incompetent officers and manned by cowards who would break at the first sign of real combat. And most critically, they were told that if captured by the Americans, they would face brutal treatment, starvation, and possible execution. This narrative was not accidental. It served multiple purposes within the Nazi state. It bolstered German morale by portraying the enemy as weak and contemptible. It discouraged surrender by instilling fear of what awaited those who laid down their arms. And it reinforced the central tenets of Nazi ideology, which held that authoritarian discipline and racial purity were the only paths to national greatness, and that the democratic, multi-ethnic experiment of the United States was doomed to collapse under its own contradictions. The reality that German prisoners encountered when they arrived on American soil shattered these assumptions with the force of revelation. The United States in 1944 was not a nation in decline. It was the most productive industrial power in human history, a country that had mobilized its economy so completely that it was simultaneously fighting wars in Europe and the Pacific, supplying its allies with vast quantities of equipment and supplies, and maintaining a standard of living for its civilian population that the Germans could scarcely imagine. The prison camps where German POWs were held reflected this abundance in ways both large and small, but nowhere was it more evident than in the food. Between 1942 and 1945, approximately 375,000 German prisoners of war were held in camps across the United States. They were housed in facilities that ranged from repurposed civilian conservation corps camps to newly constructed compounds built specifically to hold enemy prisoners. The camps were governed by the Geneva Convention, which stipulated that prisoners must be housed, fed, and treated in a manner consistent with their status as captured soldiers, not criminals. The United States took these obligations seriously, not out of any particular affection for the enemy, but because adherence to international law served American interests. The better German prisoners were treated in American camps, the more likely American prisoners would be treated humanely in German camps. It was a calculation rooted in reciprocity and pragmatism, but its effects were profound. The daily ration for a German prisoner of war in an American camp was approximately 4,000 calories, roughly equivalent to what an American soldier in a combat zone received. This figure is worth dwelling on, for it reveals much about the nature of American abundance. 4,000 calories per day was more than most German civilians were receiving in 1944, when rationing had reduced the average intake to fewer than 2,000 calories. It was far more than prisoners in German camps could expect, whether they were military prisoners or the millions of civilians and forced laborers who were being systematically starved across occupied Europe. The American ration included meat, fresh vegetables, bread, butter, and milk. It was designed not merely to keep prisoners alive but to keep them healthy, and it succeeded. But beyond the daily rations, there were the special occasions, and of these, none carried more symbolic weight than Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving in America is more than a holiday. It is a ritual of national identity, a moment when the mythology of abundance and gratitude is enacted in homes across the country. Its origins lie in the harvest festivals of the early colonial period, but by the 20th century it had evolved into something grander, a celebration that bound together themes of prosperity, family, and national unity. At the center of the Thanksgiving ritual stood the turkey, a bird native to North America, large enough to feed a family or a community, and emblematic of the plenty that the land could provide. For German prisoners of war, the decision to serve Thanksgiving turkey was an assertion of American values as much as it was a gesture of humanitarian decency. It said, without words, that even in wartime, even when resources were stretched and the outcome of the conflict remained uncertain, the United States had enough. Enough food, enough wealth, enough confidence in its own power to extend the rituals of its national life even to its enemies. It was a form of psychological warfare, though few American camp administrators would have described it in such terms. But the effect was unmistakable. On November 24, 1944, in camps from Texas to Wisconsin, from New York to California, German prisoners of war lined up in mess halls and received their Thanksgiving meal. The menu varied slightly from camp to camp, but the core components were consistent. Roasted turkey, mashed potatoes, gravy, cranberry sauce, stuffing, green beans or corn, rolls with butter, and pie for dessert. Pumpkin pie in most camps, though some served apple or mince. It was a meal that would have been unremarkable in an American home, but for the prisoners, it was an experience that defied comprehension. Klaus Hartmann sat at a long wooden table in the mess hall at Camp Clarinda, staring at the plate in front of him. The turkey was real, sliced thick and piled high, the meat still steaming. The potatoes were smooth and white, drowning in rich brown gravy. There was a bread roll, soft and warm, and a small dish of cranberry sauce, bright red and glistening. He picked up his fork, hesitated, and then began to eat. The taste was overwhelming, not because it was exotic or unfamiliar, but because it was good. It was the kind of food he had not tasted since before the war, the kind of food that belonged to a world where such things were possible. Around him, the other prisoners ate in silence, their faces registering a mixture of disbelief, confusion, and something that might have been shame. They were soldiers of the Wehrmacht, men who had been told they were fighting for the survival of the German nation against a world of enemies. They had been promised that victory would bring prosperity, that the sacrifices demanded by the war would be rewarded with land, resources, and a place in the new order that the Third Reich was building. But here they sat, defeated and imprisoned, eating a meal that their captors had provided, a meal that was better than anything they had eaten in years. What did that say about the promises they had believed? What did it say about the nation they had fought for? The psychological impact of the Thanksgiving meal on German prisoners cannot be understood without examining the broader context of their captivity. For many, the experience of being captured and transported to the United States was itself a journey into cognitive dissonance. They had expected brutality and deprivation. They had been prepared to endure. What they encountered instead was a level of material comfort and procedural fairness that contradicted everything they had been taught about the enemy. The journey across the Atlantic was the first shock. German prisoners were transported on ships that, while certainly not luxurious, were safe, clean, and adequately supplied. They were not crammed into cargo holds or left to starve. They were fed, given medical attention if needed, and treated, by and large, as human beings. Upon arrival in the United States, they were processed through reception centers where they were deloused, given clean uniforms, and assigned to camps based on their rank and perceived loyalty to the Nazi regime. The most fervent Nazis were separated and placed in high-security camps, where they could not intimidate or harm those prisoners who were less ideologically committed. At the camps themselves, the prisoners found conditions that, while restrictive, were far removed from the horrors they had imagined. They slept in heated barracks with real beds and mattresses. They had access to showers, latrines, and medical care. They were allowed to receive mail from home, though the letters often took months to arrive and were heavily censored. They were permitted to work, and those who did received a small wage in the form of camp scrip that could be used to purchase items from the camp canteen: cigarettes, candy, toiletries, and other small comforts. They were even allowed to organize recreational activities, including sports leagues, theater productions, and educational classes. This was not freedom, and it was not home, but it was a form of captivity that bore no resemblance to the fate of prisoners in German hands. By 1944, the treatment of prisoners of war in Germany had become increasingly brutal, particularly on the Eastern Front, where Soviet prisoners were subjected to starvation, forced labor, and mass execution. Even Western Allied prisoners, who were theoretically protected by the Geneva Convention, faced harsh conditions, inadequate food, and in some cases, violent reprisals. The contrast was stark, and the German prisoners in America could not help but notice. The Thanksgiving meal, then, was not an isolated gesture. It was part of a broader pattern, a demonstration of American capacity and American values that forced the prisoners to reevaluate everything they thought they knew. The turkey was not just food. It was evidence, tangible and undeniable, that the narrative they had been fed was false. The United States was not weak. It was not on the verge of collapse. It was, in fact, so strong, so wealthy, that it could afford to feed its enemies better than Germany could feed its own soldiers. Lieutenant Friedrich Weber, a tank officer captured near St. Lo in July 1944, later wrote about his experience of Thanksgiving in an American prison camp. His account, preserved in the archives of the International Committee of the Red Cross, provides a window into the internal struggle that many prisoners faced. He described the meal itself in meticulous detail: the weight of the turkey on his plate, the sweetness of the cranberry sauce, the richness of the pie. But he also described the silence that fell over the mess hall as the men ate, a silence born not of hunger satisfied but of questions that could not be answered. "We had been told that the Americans were weak," Weber wrote. "We had been told that they could not fight, that their factories produced inferior goods, that their society was rotten and would crumble under the pressure of war. And yet here we were, prisoners in the heart of their country, eating a meal that most German families could not afford even before the war. The turkey was proof that we had been lied to, proof that the war we thought we were fighting was not the war that existed. I sat there with my fork in my hand, and I felt something inside me break. Not my body, which was stronger and healthier than it had been in years, but my faith. My faith in the cause, in the leaders, in the idea that Germany was destined to rule. If we were the master race, why were we starving? If the Americans were decadent and weak, why were we eating their food, warm and safe behind their wire, while our countrymen were dying in the rubble of our cities? Weber's words capture the essence of the transformation that many prisoners underwent. The Thanksgiving turkey became a symbol, a focal point around which their doubts and disillusionment could crystallize. It was not that the meal itself changed their minds in an instant. Rather, it was the culmination of weeks and months of accumulated evidence, each piece contradicting the propaganda they had internalized. The turkey was simply the most vivid, the most undeniable, and the most difficult to rationalize away. The American officials who administered the prison camps were not unaware of the effect that such treatment had on the prisoners. Reports from camp commanders frequently noted the shift in attitude among German POWs as they spent more time in American custody. The most fanatical Nazis often remained defiant, clinging to their ideology even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. But many others, perhaps the majority, underwent a gradual process of re-education, not through formal indoctrination programs, but through the simple experience of living in America, even as prisoners. They saw American guards who were, for the most part, professional and fair. They saw a society that, despite the strains of war, functioned with a level of organization and efficiency that put the chaotic improvisation of the Nazi state to shame. They saw a diversity of people, ethnicities, and backgrounds working together, contradicting the racial theories that had been drilled into them. And they saw abundance, not just in the food but in everything. The vehicles, the machinery, the clothing, the infrastructure. It was a level of material wealth that made a mockery of the notion that democracy was a failed system. The Thanksgiving meal was, in this sense, a pedagogical tool, though not by design. It taught a lesson more powerful than any lecture or pamphlet could have conveyed. It taught that the United States, for all its flaws and contradictions, had built a society capable of sustaining a war effort of staggering magnitude while still maintaining the rituals of civilian life. It taught that abundance was not a sign of decadence, but a product of a system that valued innovation, hard work, and the freedom to pursue prosperity. And it taught, implicitly, that the German prisoners had been fighting on the wrong side of history. Not all prisoners reached this conclusion. Some remained bitter, resentful of their captivity, and convinced that Germany's defeat was the result of betrayal or bad luck rather than any fundamental weakness. Some clung to their Nazi beliefs, interpreting the good treatment they received as a form of weakness or naivety on the part of the Americans. But others, like Klaus Hartmann and Friedrich Weber, began to question. And questioning, once begun, is difficult to stop. In the months following that first Thanksgiving, Hartmann found himself thinking more and more about the meal and about what it represented. He thought about the farmers in Iowa who had raised the turkeys, the workers in the factories who had processed and packaged the food, the drivers who had transported it to the camp, and the cooks who had prepared it. He thought about the system that made such a thing possible, a system that could feed not only its own soldiers and civilians, but also the soldiers of its enemies. He thought about Germany, about the rationing and the hunger, about the cities being bombed into rubble, about the reports that filtered into the camp through letters and Red Cross visits, reports of chaos and desperation. He began to talk with the other prisoners, cautiously at first, testing their reactions. He found that many of them were thinking the same thoughts, asking the same questions. Some of the older men, veterans of the First World War, spoke of how Germany had been starved into submission in 1918, how the British blockade had brought the home front to its knees. They saw echoes of that collapse in the present, and they wondered how long Germany could hold out against an enemy that seemed to have no limits to its resources. The younger men, those who had known only the Nazi regime, struggled more. Their entire worldview had been shaped by the propaganda of the state, and to question it was to question their own identities. But the evidence was all around them, inescapable and undeniable. The barbed wire of the camp was a boundary, but it was also a lens, a point from which they could see, perhaps for the first time, the truth about the world they lived in. Christmas of 1944 brought another special meal, though it could not match the shock of the first Thanksgiving. By then, the pattern had been established. The prisoners expected good food, clean conditions, fair treatment. What had once been astonishing had become routine, and in that routinization lay a deeper transformation. The prisoners were not just learning about American abundance. They were learning to live within it, to take it for granted, to see it as normal. And in doing so, they were unlearning the scarcity mindset that had defined life in Nazi Germany. The psychological literature on prisoners of war, both from the period and in subsequent decades, has documented the phenomenon of captor identification, a process by which prisoners begin to adopt the values and perspectives of their captors. This is not the same as the Stockholm Syndrome, which involves emotional bonding born of trauma. Rather, it is a gradual cognitive shift that occurs when the prisoner's direct experience contradicts the narrative they have been taught. The more time they spend in captivity, the more their resistance erodes, not because they are coerced, but because the evidence of their own senses becomes impossible to ignore. For German prisoners in American camps, this process was accelerated by the stark contrast between their expectations and their reality. They had been prepared for suffering, and they found comfort. They had been warned of cruelty, and they encountered fairness. They had been told that the enemy was weak, and they discovered strength. The Thanksgiving turkey was a catalyst for this shift, a moment when the cognitive dissonance became too great to suppress. By the spring of 1945, as the war in Europe entered its final, apocalyptic phase, the mood in the camps had changed. News of Germany's collapse filtered in through official channels and through the letters that still arrived, though less frequently. The prisoners learned of the fall of Berlin, of Hitler's suicide, of the unconditional surrender. For some, the news brought relief. The war was over and they had survived. For others, it brought despair. Everything they had fought for, everything they had believed in, had ended in ruin. Klaus Hartmann received a letter from his sister in June 1945. She wrote of the destruction of their hometown, of the hunger that gripped the population, of the occupation by Soviet and American forces. She wrote of the shame that Germans felt, the collective realization that they had been complicit in a regime of unspeakable evil. And she wrote, with a note of bitter irony, that the American soldiers had distributed food to the starving civilians, including canned turkey. Hartmann folded the letter and put it away. He thought of the Thanksgiving meal he had eaten 7 months earlier, of the abundance that had so shocked him, and of the generosity that had bewildered him. He thought of the turkey as a symbol, not just of American wealth, but of a different way of seeing the world. In Germany, resources were hoarded, controlled by the state, distributed according to ideology and hierarchy. In America, there was enough. Enough to share, enough to give even to enemies, enough to sustain the belief that prosperity was not a zero-sum game. He wondered what kind of Germany would emerge from the ruins, and whether it could learn the lesson that the turkey had taught him. He wondered whether his countrymen, starving and defeated, could set aside the ideologies of scarcity and domination that had led them to disaster, and embrace a different vision, one in which abundance was built through cooperation rather than conquest. He did not know the answer, but he hoped. And hope, in the summer of 1945, was a fragile and precious thing. The repatriation of German prisoners of war began in 1946, and continued through 1947. The process was slow, hampered by the devastation in Europe and the complexities of administering a continent in ruins. Many prisoners did not want to return. They had heard the reports of conditions in Germany, of the starvation and the chaos, and they preferred to remain in the camps where they were fed and safe. Some even volunteered to work on American farms, where labor was scarce and the pay, though modest, was more than they could hope to earn in Germany. Those who did return carried with them the memories of their captivity, and for many, those memories included the Thanksgiving turkey. In the decades that followed, as Germany rebuilt and transformed itself into a prosperous democracy, former prisoners of war would recall that meal as a turning point, the moment when they began to see the world differently. The turkey became a story, passed down in families, a symbol of the generosity and the power of the nation that had defeated them and then fed them. Historians have debated the extent to which the treatment of German prisoners in American camps contributed to the post-war transformation of German society. It is impossible to quantify such things, to draw direct causal lines from a Thanksgiving meal to the democratic institutions of the Federal Republic of Germany. But it is clear that the experience of captivity in America had an impact, that it challenged the narratives of Nazi propaganda and offered a glimpse of an alternative. The turkey was part of that impact, a small piece of a larger mosaic, but a significant one. There is a photograph preserved in the National Archives of a Thanksgiving meal at Camp Livingston, Louisiana, in 1944. It shows a long table filled with prisoners, their heads bowed over plates piled with food. The image is grainy, the faces indistinct, but the mood is unmistakable. It is not joy exactly, nor gratitude in the conventional sense. It is something more complex, a mixture of confusion, relief, and the dawning awareness that the world is not what they had been told. The photograph captures a moment, but it also captures a truth. The truth is that wars are fought not only with weapons and armies, but with symbols and narratives, with the stories that nations tell themselves and each other. The Nazi regime had built its power on a narrative of German superiority and the inevitable triumph of the strong over the weak. The Thanksgiving turkey offered a counter-narrative, one in which strength was measured not by conquest but by the capacity to produce, to share, and to sustain. It was a narrative that said that democracy, for all its inefficiencies and contradictions, could marshal resources and human energy on a scale that totalitarianism could not match. The prisoners who ate that meal were confronted with this counter-narrative in the most visceral way possible. They could taste it, smell it, feel the warmth of it in their bellies. And in tasting it, they began to understand that they had been lied to, that the world they thought they were fighting for was a fiction, and that the enemy they had been taught to despise possessed a form of power that was both more profound and more durable than anything the Third Reich had ever achieved. In the end, the story of the German prisoners of war and the Thanksgiving turkey is a story about the transformative power of abundance. It is a story about how a simple meal, served in a prison camp in the American heartland, could shatter the myths of an ideology and plant the seeds of a new understanding. It is a story about the ways in which material conditions shape consciousness, and how the experience of generosity, even from an enemy, can open minds that propaganda has closed. The turkey was not just food. It was a message, delivered not through words but through the act of provision. The message was that the United States, despite the vast distances of the Atlantic and the distractions of a two-front war, had the capacity to care for its enemies as well as its own. It was a message that said that abundance was not weakness but strength, that the ability to feed and clothe and house millions of people, soldiers and civilians and prisoners alike, was the true measure of national power. And it was a message that the prisoners, hungry and defeated, could not help but receive. Klaus Hartmann returned to Germany in the autumn of 1946. He found a nation transformed by destruction, a landscape of rubble and despair. but he also found in the ruins the beginnings of something new. The occupation authorities were distributing food, rebuilding infrastructure, and laying the groundwork for a democratic state. The process was slow and painful, marked by hardship and resentment, but it moved forward. And Hartmann, remembering the turkey he had been served in a prison camp in Iowa, allowed himself to believe that perhaps out of the ashes, something better could be built. He never forgot that meal. In the years that followed, as he raised a family and watched Germany rise from the ruins to become a prosperous and peaceful nation, he would sometimes tell his children about the Thanksgiving turkey. He told them about the shock he had felt, the confusion and the slow dawning of understanding. He told them that the turkey had taught him that the world was larger and more complex than the narrow vision of the regime he had served. And he told them that abundance, the simple fact of having enough, was not something to be taken for granted but something to be built, protected, and shared. The turkey, in the end, was a gift. Not just a gift of food, though it was certainly that, but a gift of perspective, a gift of truth. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments of history, even in the midst of the most terrible wars, there are acts of decency and generosity that transcend the boundaries of enmity. And it was a symbol of the idea that freedom and democracy, for all their flaws, possess a generative power that authoritarianism can never match. A power that springs from the belief that people, given the opportunity, will build rather than destroy, will share rather than hoard, and will choose hope over despair. The prisoners who received that turkey in 1944 were the enemies of the United States. They had fought to destroy the very system that now fed them. But in feeding them, in treating them with dignity and fairness, America did more than fulfill its obligations under international law. It planted seeds that would bear fruit in the decades to come, seeds of doubt in the minds of those who had believed in totalitarianism, and seeds of possibility in a world that desperately needed them. The turkey was a small thing, a single meal in a long and brutal war. But sometimes, small things carry meanings that echo across generations, and the taste of that Thanksgiving turkey, served in a prison camp in the heart of America, carried with it the promise that even from defeat, something new and better could grow.